Hello and welcome to the next module in remote teaching. So this session is all about e-learning good practice and how we can utilize different aspects to create more effective online instruction. What I'm hoping to cover in this module with you is, so what does good practice look like in e-learning? I think that's quite a significant question as we all find ourselves in this unexpected space and how we begin to unpick what some good practice might look like. How can I sequence the lesson for effective learning? So I hope to answer those questions by the end of this session. So just to give you a few principles of the remote lesson design that I try to build my instruction upon. And these are kind of timeless principles. They're like laws of good teaching. So we deal with memory and retention. We look at how the brain learns and absorbs and keeps that information. We look at something called readiness and engagement. How ready are our students for learning? And visual coding, how we can use visuals to explain difficult or tricky concepts. And finally, this aspect called deliberate practice, how we get students to actually engage with the task or skill that we're trying to teach. So one of the first things that I do in each lesson is a basic equipment check. And this might seem rather ridiculous for online instruction, but I usually want students to write. I want them to have produced something by the end of the lesson. Not all the time, but I would say 99% of my lessons, there must be an output, an end product. So what you don't want is halfway through the session when you get or you request for your students to actually undertake a particular task, they're rushing around for paper. So I always do this at the beginning. I say, right, equipment check. There's a race, you've got 30 seconds to grab your notepad and set of pens, highlighters, whatever you need for this session. And it's interesting when you start to hear the rustlings going on in the background of all of the students hastily trying to gather materials to start the lesson. So that's just something basic that I do, and that's about readiness for learning. Once that's out the way, I move on to expectations. There's certain expectations that we all have when we taught live lessons with students in front of us. Do not let those standards slip. They will look slightly different perhaps, but you have to begin with some expectations. And my 3 rules: I want full participation. We'll have no passengers. I would like you to express your ideas, so that would be in the chat, or if I'm allowing students to have their cameras on, it might be raising your hand, and I ask them to leave comments if they can. So, you know, in the moments where it might be more lecture style, I will ask them to drop questions in, leave comments, so I know that there is some engagement in the material and the presentation. So I've done equipment check, I've expressed my expectations, then I would go on to something around brainstorming, which really taps into prior knowledge. I think this is crucial. You have to activate prior knowledge. And that could be a simple brainstorming activity, listing, something really simple, kind of low bar to entry, just to get students thinking. And here's an example of one of my tasks. That's just a brainstorm activity. What are some of the ways we can tell if a text is true? So I try to keep my instruction as close to my normal instruction in the class as possible. So in our school, every lesson would begin with a do now activity. And I would religiously start my lessons with a do now activity. I don't want that to change. In the midst of inconsistency and chaos, which we call the pandemic, again, we want that consistency. We want to have patterns. Patterns are very calming. Patterns are very reassuring. So I always start my online lessons in much the same way I would start my live lessons. So that's my prior knowledge check. And again, I would ask students to be putting some of those ideas in the chat. So I'm seeing where students are. I'm thinking, that's not quite right. So-and-so's never heard of critical thinking. Okay, this person's really clear on critical thinking. I need to do some work with this little group over here or this group of students. So that's my prior knowledge check. Around the subject, of memory and retention, you may have seen this before. This is Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. And you can see along the x-axis that starts off with immediately running through to 31 days, a month's time. This shows the elapsed time since learning, so how many days since the initial learning event. And on the y-axis, you can see the percentage of retention. So you can see after somebody has learned something immediately, you've got pretty much 100% retention. After 31 days, you can see that drops to 21%. This happens if there is no intervention in between the point of the learning process or the how can I put it, the learning event, if you like. And what happens is retention decreases over time. So the idea is that students, with the guidance of a teacher, actively try to recall that information. And this is how this is how the brain then forms different neural pathways. And those neural pathways get stronger and stronger each time you engage in that learning event. It's a bit like tying your shoelaces. You know, as a child tying their shoelaces, if you say, right, here's how you tie your shoelaces, that's your lesson. And then you come back in a month's time, they would have forgotten how to tie their shoelaces, most children. The idea is that you have rehearsals. So every day you practice tying shoelaces, and then every other day, and then every week, and then till finally that process and that act becomes so ingrained that it's habitual. A bit like learning your times tables or your alphabet. And I'll give you an example. So I will start off with a pop quiz. And a pop quiz is always to test memory. Okay? You want to see what has stuck. So one of the things I do that as an English teacher and a general paper teacher, I'm really big on vocabulary and increasing students' vocabulary. I think there's something very powerful about that. So one of the words that they learned was egregious. I would then get them to define that word again. So I want to see if they can bring back to memory the definition of the word. Then I want to see if they can bring back to memory how to utilize that word. And then for them to think about the word, and then there'll be some other task in there. So my pop quiz is usually a retention quiz, really. Trying to strengthen those neural pathways. So I would say that's really a good element or really an element of good practice for online education. And you will start to see the parallels between what you normally do in the classroom with online instruction. They become very apparent. Again, as I said, one of the things I often do is get students to practice vocabulary. Here's a word that I wanted them to use in an argument essay. I'll give them the word, I would give an example and the type of word, whether it's a noun, adjective, verb, etc. And sometimes I would try to break down the etymology of the word here. So we've got the Greek root words here. And then I would ask students to practice the word. So you can see quite a few things happening here. This is drawing on the work of Isabel Beck in her book, the title escapes me, completely gone. Bringing Words to Life. That's the title, Bringing Words to Life. And she said, there's no point giving students vocabulary in a vacuum. It has to be in the context of something. So here you can see this example, panacea, is in the context of the pandemic. So students immediately get that. A mask and gloves are certainly no panacea for protecting oneself against infection. They get that, it's in context. Then I get them to practice it. So you can see modeling going on here, detailed explanations, and then deliberate practice. Again, as I said, this idea that I want there to be some output. And I will get students to put that in the chat, and I'll just be ticking off the list of names who has actually submitted something. And maybe those others who didn't manage to use a word, I could speak to them privately in the chat or just make a note of them and give them a little bit more time. Earlier in this module, I spoke about the importance of visual coding. This idea of critical reading, some students find very difficult. And just the concept, so not even speaking about the practice now, just the concept of reading critically. So one of your most powerful skills and learning tools, if you like, as a teacher is your ability to explain and to use various aids such as analogies to explain. So here, when I was speaking about critical reading, I gave this analogy. So imagine you have a text, okay? And think about an interrogation room where a detective is interrogating a suspect. And what they're doing is shining a light on that suspect, and they're presenting a myriad of questions in order to find out what's true. Where were you? Why were you there? What were you wearing? Who were you with? All of these kinds of questions to arrive at a holistic picture of what happened. And then I take this concept that they understand and explain it in the context of looking at a text. You are interrogating a text, just like a detective interrogates a suspect. So imagine the text is on trial. You're trying to find out what's true. Who wrote this text? Can we trust this voice? At what time was it written? Does the style and the voice seem anachronistic to the time that it was written, or is there some kind of incongruence there? So this is one of your most powerful tools, the concept of analogy in explaining some quite difficult and complex ideas to your students. A very short module with just some really bite-sized things that you can take away. So we looked at power of analogy, we looked at memory and retention, and we also looked at deliberate practice and vocabulary work, equipment checks and expectations, and this idea of readiness for learning. Again, if you'd like any ideas further explained to you, you can contact me via email, and you can also subscribe to my blog at keystolearn.org, where I'll be sharing information and some ideas around remote teaching. I hope this was useful for you, and again, all the best with your efforts in designing better remote teaching.